Um, this is a session on IPF at 20. This year, the forum has turned 20 years. Poonam, so we will start first with the...
we can launch the journal.
Yeah, so what we do usually at one of these sessions, well, not every session is for IPF at 20, but we do have a session like this usually, where we reveal the journal from the conference the previous year. So we are going to begin first with the launch of the IPF 2023, which is the 20th issue of the forum. So shall we do that?
Yeah, why don't we?
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we opening this?
This was nicely packed, easy to open, easy to open, you know.
It's been harder in previous years.
Yeah, many times, you know. Good administration.
And a particular clap to the editors.
All right. Okay. All right. So Poonam thought that we ought to have a little bit of chat among the individuals who have served as the editors of this journal. We don't have every one of the editors at this session, but we have most of them. So this journal was founded by Suman Bery, who is now the Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog. But this was in 2003, and the journal was founded with in collaboration with the Brookings Institution. And the model, as I recall it, was the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. I don't know why we did not call these Indian economic papers on, or Indian papers on economic activity, or NCAER papers on economic activity, but that is why we are here to find out. So, Suman, this was your initiative. I had joined you at that time, but I've always wondered myself what the backstory to this was. Yeah, I know that you brought me as the outside editor for the journal with Barry Bosworth, who was, of course, representing the Brookings side. But what was the thinking?
Okay, I'll be brief, Arvind, for two reasons. One is that the tribute is to those who've kept it going 20 years, not the person who launched it. And I say this with a grandson in town at the moment. So, you know, you don't go back to the grandfather and say, what were you thinking, you know, when you gave birth to your daughter, etc. But, and Anil Padmanabhan has spent his precious time getting the backstory, which will be edited and available online. But briefly, I think so much has changed in the last 20 years, including NCAER, that some of what I'm going to say will seem slightly surprising. When I was at the World Bank working on Latin America, I did read Brookings papers in economic activity, most of which was on the US economy, but there was quite a bit there on specifically Latin America. There was this trio of academics, Rudy Dornbusch, Stan Fisher, and Jeff Sachs, who, you know, followed what was going in Latin America. And Latin America was going from mess to mess to mess. And, you know, they were enjoying column inches in, or column pages in Brookings. And the point about BPA as a format, and I hope India Policy Forum, is two things. It's accessible, it's not about methodology, it is about policy. And second, I haven't looked at the most recent issue, there is crucially a narrative on the discussion, so you get different points of view on the issue. So that's what appealed to me about the format. What I learned and in the setting up of this is that the lowest of the low amongst academics is the conference volume. And people will never take publication in a conference volume seriously. And the only way to do this is to shame people by having a very high quality advisory panel. And so these were all the insights that Abhijit Banerjee actually shared with me when he agreed to be a kind of a co-sponsor on this initiative. I remember a conversation at the University of Michigan. And so we began with, and the other point I should make was that, 2001 when I was offered the job, or 2000 when I was offered the job to come to NCAER, it was 10 years into the reforms. We were doing pretty well, but the story wasn't told. And 20 years later, I have to say, Arvind, now in my role as a government flack, I do find that the India story is not all that well understood. What has changed in the meantime is that development economics as a field has mushroomed, and development studies on India are in many ways at the center of it. So the short answer is, it was to provide exposure to Indian research, but on policy issues, and the way to do this was to have, as it were, real-time refereeing rather than the kind of refereeing that goes on with an academic journal. So I hope that gives you the backstory. And yes, Brookings did provide support, and their condition for providing support, which was only, if you like, branding, not financial, we had to raise the money, was that to ensure quality, they needed a Brookings editor, Barry Bosworth, who knew nothing about India, and they needed somebody local who knew about India, and that was you.
All right. So, how do you think this journal has shaped up over 20 years? You think this is how you had conceived it, or you had conceived it as being far more empirical than it is, or?
What I would say is that for somebody like myself, what it I think continues to be, and I think that was part of my aspiration, again, to go back to the grandfather image, one doesn't quite know, it was a leap in the dark. But 20 years later, the fact that it's through the through the efforts of successors, not just me, it has earned its kind of place has continued for 20 years. If you had asked me, would you have expected it to last 20 years? I would have said that was a very tall aspiration. I didn't know. And it has, I think, it remains the case that both for Indian academics and for foreign academics, they will publish here, is my understanding, only because they think it will bring them into contact with policymakers in real time, which of course couldn't happen during COVID, and B, because it has now developed a cachet as being a place where policymakers and scholars kind of come together. So I would say that was probably more of the IPF brand than it is of the Brookings brand, and I think that has been taken forward, and therefore it remains, as it were, the go-to place for me. So, for example, I'm working on Odisha now, and I still remember Dilip Mukherjee's paper on, as it were, the backward districts of Odisha. So I think it is, it is a reference source, and for that I'm pleased, but others should take the credit.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so to challenge you, Poonam, you think this journal is going to go on for the next 20 years?
I should not speak on behalf of my successors. It will certainly go
Well,
on.
maybe you will go for 20 years.
Well, certainly for the next 8 years that I'm going to be here. I've already completed 2 years. It's a great product. It's a great event. And let me just add some of my experiences about associating with IPF. I still remember when Rana Hassan, Utsav Kumar and I presented a paper at a conference at ICREER. Actually, Suman and Barry Bosworth came to the presentation, they asked us to submit a paper to the IPF, and that is how my association started. I don't know whether I should be proud or embarrassed that I have published 8 times. Proud because it's a great outlet. Embarrassed, did I not have alternatives? I don't know. So I come from a policy background. I didn't have the pressure to actually publish in ranked journals, though I have published, which gave me the flexibility to engage on a topic that was interesting to me and my co-authors. Barry Egan Green has been a frequent co-author, Rana Hassan has been a co-author, and every time I really enjoyed the process of writing the paper, bringing it here, being challenged by a room full of very excited and opinionated audience, not to mention the discussants. For me, the effort has been every bit worth it. The reason I'm saying it is because we're always looking for interesting, relevant papers, including from some of the younger academics who are here, who are perhaps still just aspiring to publish in journals which have a very small and niche audience, which does not perhaps help with policy making directly. So it is for them that consider publishing at IPF. And we have actively sought out and called many of them actually to this year's conference as discussants, as chairs. And you will see that shift happening. So it is to get people excited about the policy questions on India and finding fulfillment out of it. Don't think of it as a duty. Oh, I also did this. It's really a very rewarding exercise. Just one more thing. Just look at the 2 founding editors and look at the places they have reached. So there is a real possession there as well. You know, come and associate with the IPF and you really reach very high offices.
You know, a lot of these people are thinking that is there a correlation or causation?
It is.
And we all know that it's Princeton, right?
So let me turn to you, Karthik. So I start with you with a warning, you know, that there are other panelists here, so be succinct in phrasing your in framing your answers. Okay, so how has been your experience being an editor? I'm sure you have been editing other journals. How is this different from what you do for other journals?
Thanks, Arvind. No, in fact, I guess my story is a bit like Poonam's in that my first encounter with the IPF was as an author, writing a paper in 2013 on education. And it was a risky thing to do. I remember it was pre-tenure, and you know, it was, is this what I should be doing? But I just remember feeling so encouraged that Abhijit Banerjee was there, and I think both Montek and Dr. Narendra Jadhav, who then working on the education chapter of the 12th plan, were there. And it was just incredibly satisfying seeing kind of a body of research brought together in a background paper, much of which then made its way into the 12th five-year plan. So I think, you know, to me, that was a very satisfying experience. It wasn't in any way and then, you know, I've written a couple of other papers, and then when you moved on to NITI and I was invited to take on, you know, that academic role, it was a pleasure. And I think I have just tried to invite papers from typically young tenured faculty, so you're not in the pressure of needing to publish for tenure, but you have a bit of a body of work that you can now synthesize. So that, in a way, to me, is almost like the sweet spot of a perfect IPF paper, that you've gotten tenure and a body of work, that you now have something that you want to bring together. And then, you know, what we offer is serious policymakers at the table. And I mean, in some ways, if you think about the translation from research to policy, academics are in universities writing deep papers, take 6, 7, 8 years, refereed and published in top journals. But the policy windows are very narrow, and the academics don't know when the policy windows are. So the role of a good think tank really is to have a bunch of PhDs who both know the research and know the policy windows and are able to synthesize the research in a way that can feed into policy. So, you know, the goal for IPF, for me at least, is to kind of create a repository of papers that, because the thing about policy and research is that the time windows don't align, right? So research takes a much longer time. Policy, when the policy window is there, the policymaker is listening, but otherwise they're not. And so how do you, so luck is when preparation meets opportunity, so you don't know when the opportunity will be there, but the IPF hopefully over time provides kind of a roster of policy relevant, policy ready papers that can be part of a mental filing system for people in policy to then be able to access. So yeah, so I don't do much other editing. I run other grant programs and do a lot of reviewing and decision making in that setting. I think IPF relative to that is a lot more fun because typically, you're not trying to nitpick on things and reject papers and here and there. You're more trying to encourage very, very smart academics to step beyond the narrow of one paper to say, let's take a broader view and what have we learned. So it's been a lot of fun.
Okay. So Pravin, you are the latest addition to the editorial board. How are you finding it? What are you looking forward to?
Yeah, so thanks, Arvind. Yeah, and so I've been with IPF now just over a year. Prior to that, I was mostly a consumer of whatever was being published in IPF and at the conferences themselves. It's been a great experience this last year. I think the challenge for us as co-editors on this has primarily been at the kind of the solicitation or commissioning of paper stage, where you're really looking to match issues that are of ongoing policy interest or policy concern for policymakers in India with the work of scholars who are working at the cutting edge of their respective fields, and to see if there's policy dimensions to their work that would be relevant for the IPF. And so that's been the kind of the interesting part of the challenge. As far as the editorial process itself, I think like Karthik mentioned, it's in many ways it's been far easier than your kind of standard editorial role in journals. I think the work is much more cooperative in a sense with the authors. You're not looking to reject papers. You're kind of working with the author to kind of get the paper through, amplify certain parts of the paper maybe that'll be more relevant for a policy-making audience. And so it feels like a much more of a joint production function than a kind of a contentious or an antagonistic, or possibly even an antagonistic relationship of the type that might develop in a standard journal. So yes, it's been a lot of fun. As far as the relevance of the IPF itself, I certainly feel that the output, what's being published here, is much more accessible as intended to policymakers than what typically gets published in academic journals. And to that extent, I think it's enormously satisfying. Of course, this varies a bit by field, but in certain fields, in particular mine, international trade, I would say that what is published here, including the paper from this last year by Amit Khandelwal, would certainly be a much more accessible and relevant paper for policymakers than what typically gets published in the field of international trade in top journals today. So that feels exciting and fun and relevant as well, satisfying.
So let me return to you, Suman. Given where you're sitting currently, what are the 2 or 3 papers you would like to see in the next year's IPF?
Well, what I did find in my speaking tour of East Coast campuses is there is just a lot of research going on in individual Indian states. And I can't say offhand how much of that has found its way into the IPF already, but because of my, my 4 years, well, not only the 4 years in Europe, but then my participation as a non-resident fellow of Bruegel, one has to really think of India as the equivalent of the EU, and each state is worthy of its own development strategy. But that development strategy, ought to be based on some kind of a research basis. NITI is attempting to create that now, but somehow collating the kind of research that is going on in a variety of fields. Quite a few of them have to do with climate and the energy transition, but not all. So I think that that going, and this has also been my advice to investors and things like that, is that a lot of the action, and this is something that comes directly from the Prime Minister, a lot of the action is and will be, and of course you discussed it in the fiscal paper this morning, at the subnational level. So I think thinking and looking actively for work at the subnational level would be something that I'd commend. There are issues in finance, but I'll have an opportunity to talk about those as the chair of Helen's session. And I know you want to move on to Poonam, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Maybe can we take a couple of comments from the floor, just in case? We have a lot of authors who have contributed to the IPF over the years. So if don't feel compelled, if nobody asks, then we'll carry on the conversation at this end. But if you would like to share your thoughts, past authors, current authors, future. Rana.
Yeah, just wanted to say that...
Take the microphone.
I think I've been able to... it's 3 times. I think I've been an author 3 times. Poonam once with you, once with Devashish, then once... I think by that time, IPF decided, okay, let's just tell this guy to do something on his own. So that was the urban one. And I must say, I've really enjoyed the discussion section of the IPF. It's just so unparalleled. The discussion comments and then the open floor discussion. And what's really nice, and I think there are a lot of people who are hopefully potential contributors for next time or after that, is that you sort of do it's more fun. It's more fun because there's not that pressure that you're just thinking. Karthik, you were mentioning that it's like a journal publication. You have to do it. It's just a lot more fun. And yeah, so just really want to thank all of you. For that opportunity.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. So Poonam, back to you. Well, one of the things actually I notice is that this year I see many more women in the audience than I have seen ever in the past. So that is a big change you seem to have brought, which was much needed. What else are we going to see in the next 2 or 3 years, not 20, but just 2 or 3.
So there has been effort to not just uphold the quality and relevance of the journal, but to improve it further, which is an overarching goal, but also to make this entire event and journal or volume more inclusive. So as you mentioned, more diverse voices, whether they are as paper authors, whether they are as discussants or chairs. I'm not very young myself, but I often see being pushed out in favor of people who are much older. So it's only in India that somebody in her mid-50s is considered young, it's not elsewhere. So, so just to make, the process a little bit younger, so to speak.
Suman and me, I think.
Not you.
We've moved on.
but I think people have started to notice the difference, that voices need to be heard before we move on, so to speak. And I can see those who agree with me are already smiling. So just more diverse, also in terms of researchers who are based here in India and those who are abroad, voices from the women, younger people, etc. But going forward, one more change that we are hoping to bring, and here everybody has to contribute, they have to give us the exciting work. As Rana said, and as I found the process to be really a lot of fun, primarily because neither Rana nor I had the pressure to publish in peer-reviewed journals. We were looking for fun while we were doing research as a side job, right? So most of our research happens after hours and on weekends, so it better be fun. But some of the topics that are very important, Suman absolutely mentioned state-level stories. We have started to make the transition. It may not be state-specific to begin with. Papers are always welcome, but we will work on all the states together for the fiscal sustainability. We have a paper planned on growth convergence or divergence at the state level. Climate transition is a very important issue. Women-led development. As we mentioned this morning, Ratna Sai has joined us and we have very high hopes. She's at the forefront of the work at the intersection of gender and macro. Digital, the promise that digital brings to India's development. India has its own unique model of development primarily because of It's a really advanced stage in digital. So these are some of the areas in which we will move. At the same time, we are opportunistic. If we get a good paper in any other area, we'll be very happy to take. Thanks.
Now, you are also a member of the PMEAC, the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So sitting from there, how do you see the IPF helping or not helping?
So it certainly helps, but my humble experience interacting with various parts of the government, not just PMEAC, is that I have more to learn from them than I can tell them, in the sense a lot of humility in what technical training and academic research can bring to the table and what is it that the policymakers need. Not just the language being accessible. These days, partly because of the efforts of IPF and other such endeavors, a lot of the time policymakers tell us, we know the what, tell us the how, and how is the hardest part. One little example is that I was at the Ministry of Commerce for a meeting, and they started asking me about services sector exports, or just promoting the services sector to grow faster. And I quickly am ramming through in my mind, which paper, and I said, okay, so research shows that skill development and exchange rate depreciation will really help. And they just looked at me, as if they didn't understand. They said, okay, so can we do a PLI for services? What do you say, right? So they are looking at the policy instruments that they have. Exchange rate is not their policy instrument. They don't believe that exchange rate can necessarily result in services exports to grow faster. So that's the real challenge which we all have. So we think that through IPF we are bridging the gap between research and policy, but we have to go much further than that. The other is the political economy of everything, which is a very interesting part for me to understand, that how do you even interact with the policymakers to say things in a way that they can relate to it. And IPF is bridging that gap only partly.
Okay, I think I'll go with that actually, because in my own experience, what happens is that we as economists want to go to the policymakers and say, this is the good stuff I have done, implement it. Policymaker says, well, I didn't win election on your platform, I won the election on my platform, so tell me what you can do, which is promised in my platform. So I think there is that gap, which is a glaring gap between the way economists think and how the politicians actually expect the help. All right, I think our time is over. We will continue the show and we'll continue it for at least the next 20 years. Some of us will not be around perhaps then, but the show will go on. Shall we conclude with that? Thank you.